All right, we'll see how long this gets, but we're going to try to tackle both the Mughal Empire and the Russians in one. This is probably a mistake, but, take a break if you need to in the middle. The Mughals, like the Ottomans, were a very strong empire and lasted for about 225 years in India. It's sort of a chance that that's where this happens. The founder, Babur, descended from two of the most powerful men to ever live, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. They both had bigger empires than the Mughals, but it's going to give him some legitimacy as a ruler anyway. Babur was a Sunni Muslim, sort of a wandering prince. The idea of a wandering prince was fairly common, as there were many princes around, each trying to carve out their own little piece of the world to rule. In Babur's case, he came down through Kabul in about 1526 and declared himself the Sultan of the Mughal Empire. While it's spelled with a U, it's pronounced like an O, Mughals. And this is a variation on Mongols, which is what Genghis Khan was. Babur started the dynasty, but Akbar made it an empire. Akbar was the grandson of Babur and was sort of the golden age of the Mughals. Akbar and his successors took almost the entire Indian subcontinent into their domain. That meant that about 100 to 125 million people were part of the Mughal Empire. Most of them were Hindus, and they were thus ruled by a Muslim minority, which is why Akbar granted some measures of religious toleration. First, he outlawed a tax on non-Muslims, and allowed non-Muslims to build and maintain their houses of worship. He also married a Hindu woman, making his son a living amalgamation of the majority faith and the ruling faith. This toleration basically went on as long as people followed the rules. Akbar was not afraid of attacking those who stepped out of line. In his quest for religious harmony, Akbar created what he called the divine faith, which was a combination of Islam, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Sikh, and Christian beliefs. He was a man who was curious about the world and regularly hosted open debates at the court. This toleration only lasted as long as Akbar did, though. His successors, Shah Jahan and most notably Aurangzeb, Akbar's great-grandson, did away with toleration. In fact, Aurangzeb reinstituted the tax on non-Muslims. Economically speaking, the Mughals will be in a very good position for a time. India has tremendous resources, unlike the Safavids in Iran. There's a lot of agricultural products, the main one being cotton. Cotton cloth was a big deal to the rest of the world, and before the 1790s, cotton wasn't really grown much in North America because of the difficulty of removing seeds from the boll, the puff of cotton on the plant. Once Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin to remove the seed from the lint, all of that changed, but that's after the Mughals. Once Vasco da Gama made an oceanic visit to India in 1497, there was a shipping connection to Europe. Indian traders sold the Europeans cotton cloth and spices. Portuguese traded Indian ivory and ebony to China and brought back gold, silk, porcelain, and copper. By the 1600s, traders wanted tons of cheap Indian cotton cloth and glass beads to trade to West Africans for enslaved people, and to North American people for furs. The establishment of the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company in the early 1600s meant that there were two big shipping partners. At this point, the era of Akbar, India was the wealthiest empire. However, that will not last. During Aurangzeb's rule, the empire was facing expensive wars to maintain the empire and was basically running short of cash. His father, Shah Jahan, had ordered the construction of the Taj Mahal as a tomb for his beloved wife. But its construction, along with other architectural displays, plus trying to fund a military for maintaining the empire, practically bankrupted the Mughals. However, the British East India Company would in time plant the seeds for a British takeover of India and have a stranglehold on the subcontinent until the 20th century. The Mughals officially collapsed in 1857 when British Queen Victoria was named the Empress of India and effectively the last Mughal. But it was just hobbling along after Aurangzeb died in 1707. We'll switch gears now for the final empire, the Russians. Now, the Russians are another empire that lasted into the 20th century. We're just going to cover the time period up to Catherine the Great, who took over ruling in 1762. The Russian Empire included Russia. and also northern Asia and into North America, in Alaska, even down into Washington State, Oregon, California, even to an extent. Prince Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, terrible meaning fearsome, established the Russian Empire in 1533, although its roots go back even further. Ivan, though, was the first to take the title of Tsar, and it's spelled sometimes Tsar, it's also spelled Czar. It was a title based on the Roman idea of Caesar. The title was grand, but the empire was not, at least not for a while. It was backward, landlocked, and poor. With only one seaport for trading, they needed to do something to expand. So they looked to Siberia. Siberia was the one place open to expansion. There was no way to take on the Ottomans, who controlled access to the Black Sea, and all the trade to India had to go through Iran. Through Siberia, the Russians were able to access the Pacific Ocean, whereby they crossed into Alaska eventually. As the empire expanded, it became a very diverse place in languages, religions, and ethnic identities. And using this map, you can see just how big of a place it encompassed, a lot of different ethnicities within there. Islam prevailed as the predominant religion in Siberia, although the Eastern Orthodox Christians did their best to convert anyone and everyone. Russians were farmers, hunters, and while the people incorporated in the empire were either herders or caravan workers or hunters and fishers along the Siberian rivers. Most of the Russian army consisted of Cossacks, who were native to the area between Moscow and the Caspian and Black Seas. The Cossacks also established every major town in Siberia. In 1633, the aristocracy of Russia elected a new Tsar, and that was Mikhail Romanov. He was the first in what would be a long line of Romanovs up to the 20th century. His most notable development had to do with the change in the law that changed how the laboring class worked. Like the sultans and the shahs of the Mughal, Ottoman, and Safavids, the Russians rewarded military service of nobles with land grants. Peasants were obliged to work for the lord of the land, and the rising commercialization of agriculture raised the value of these labor obligations. Laws and customs permitted peasants to change masters during about a 2-week period each year. This encouraged lords to treat their peasants well. But warfare in the late 16th and early 17th centuries disrupted peasant life, and many of them fled to the Cossacks or into Siberia. Those who stayed sold themselves into slavery to keep from starving. When peace returned, landlords sought to recover the runaways and bind them more tightly to the land. So the change of law in 1649 eliminated the period when peasants could change masters and ordered runaways to return to their masters, thus transforming peasants into serfs. Serfdom was a hereditary condition, the idea being the serf was tied to a piece of land, not owned by the master. Owners had absolute control over the serfs' lives and could buy, sell, and trade them at will. Serfs were no different from chattel slaves in that respect. However, unlike American slavery, serfs could marry, although in many cases they were forced to marry someone who was already on the estate to which they were bound. Serfs made up over half the population. Landowners were only 2% of the population. Now, serfs do not take their in-serfdom without a revolt, and there will be several over time, although they don't result in any meaningful end to serfdom. Now, the biggest leader in the Russian Empire was Peter the Great. And I don't mean just big as in like most important. He was a big guy. He was about 6'7" in a world where most people were definitely not that tall. He was a big guy. Strangely, he had small hands and feet. Kind of stumbled when he walked. That might have been due to the drinking. Anyway, Peter was aware of European wealth and military power, and he's living in the exciting time of Isaac Newton, the scientific revolution. He's into that. He's not into the trappings of court and politics like how Akbar had hosted different people and debates. He's looking at his people and he wants to make them a modern military power. When he ascended the throne, there had been many innovations in wartime technologies and strategies, and so he undertook the cause of modernization of the state and also of the military. And Peter the Great is going to do this thing where he basically hides himself, he disguises himself, and goes on a tour of Western Europe. He learns shipbuilding from the Dutch. He takes on all these like odd jobs. It's like undercover boss, but I guess you could call it undercover czar. Anyway, he's going to construct a very formidable navy and waged war on the Ottoman Empire as a crusade to liberate Constantinople/Istanbul from the Muslim forces. Peter believed he was the legal protector of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule. This is going to be a common theme for Russia. More than protection, though, he wanted expansion. So he waged what's called the Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721. This war had everything. Well, not everything. But this war involved Poland, Russia, Denmark/Norway. They were one country at one point. Sweden was the power at the time. Sweden defeated Poland and Denmark, but was unable to defeat Peter the Great's Russian army. The modernized armies broke Swedish control of the Baltic Sea, making greater contact possible with European markets. He established St. Petersburg and made it the capital of the empire, and commenced massive building projects there. Now, Peter wanted the architecture and overall popular styles of clothing to imitate Europe as much as possible. The campaign of westernization meant that the wives of military officers, merchants, and other political officials should come along and socialize. They would all meet together and socialize. Underneath this move towards westernization, however, was a move towards autocracy. A decree in 1716 said the Tsar, quote, is not obliged to answer to anyone in the world for his doings, but possesses power and authority over the kingdom and land to rule them at his will and pleasure as a Christian ruler, end quote. This led him to push towards increased taxes for the military, bringing the church under his control and building factories, but also more forced labor on the serfs. In this regard, Peter the Great was much like the authoritarian rulers in the Islamic empires. It was Peter's way or the highway. Now, one thing I think we should probably be able to do in looking at all these different kind of common factors of each empire is to be able to sort of compare and contrast them. This is something that the book does really well. The chapter on the empires is going to definitely help add to this lecture. So definitely look into that possible test question. I don't know, something about them. Definitely there will be a quiz question about this. All right, next up, East Asian empires.